The mechanical click of my office door closing behind me echoed through the empty hallway, sounding exactly like the first time I shut it 23 years ago. Back then, this space was nothing more than a glorified supply closet with a flickering fluorescent bulb and a desk that wobbled every time I typed. Now it was a corner suite with floor-to-ceiling glass, an ergonomic chair that cost more than my first car, and a brushed steel plaque that designated me as the chief architecture engineer. I stood there with my hand lingering on the brass handle, staring into the dark room. The potted fern in the corner drooped slightly, reflecting my exact mood. A framed photograph of the original startup team sat on the top shelf, angled just slightly off-center. The cleaning staff had bumped it 3 weeks ago, and I had purposely left it that way. In hindsight, maybe I knew this moment was inevitably approaching. Outside my door, the main operations floor hummed with the quiet tension of an afternoon shift. Analysts stared intently at their dual monitors, pretending they were entirely focused on their spreadsheets while desperately avoiding eye contact with me. When you survive at a technology firm for over 2 decades, you become part of the furniture. Your name transforms into a quiet legend that new hires search for on the corporate intranet. And yet, none of that history matters when the current administration decides you're suddenly obsolete. A single, sanitized sentence delivered by an overly groomed executive is all it takes to wipe away 23 years of loyalty. Trent Holloway had literally grinned when he delivered the final blow, leaning back in his leather chair like he had just checkmated a grandmaster. But I am getting slightly ahead of myself. If you are enjoying this dive into corporate chaos, make sure you hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It takes just a second, but it genuinely helps the team bring you more stories of professional betrayal and strategic revenge. Trust me, you will want to hear how Trent's little power trip completely imploded. Now, walking away from a platform you literally built from scratch is a surreal experience. When I first joined this chaotic operation, the entire codebase was held together by hope and excessive amounts of caffeine. The servers were physically located in a damp basement that constantly smelled of mildew and stale pizza. I was 25 years old, fueled by ambition and cheap takeout, writing the foundational logic for what would eventually evolve into an $850 million enterprise software suite. I typed the very first authentication protocols on a laptop that randomly overheated, sitting on a milk crate because we could not afford proper chairs. I did not just manage the infrastructure, I was the infrastructure. While the sales team celebrated minor victories at expensive bars downtown, I stayed behind to patch critical vulnerabilities and rebuild the database architecture. Over the years, I watched 4 different chief executive officers come and go. Most of them were confident talkers with shiny degrees who thought they were visionaries. None of them lasted, and none of them ever questioned my authority over the system. I was the silent guardian, the ghost in the machine. When the entire client portal crashed at 3 in the morning on a holiday weekend, they did not call the board of directors, they called me. I quietly stabilized the servers, resolved the deadlocks, and kept the digital heart beating. Then Trent Holloway arrived. Trent was brought in by a private equity group that had recently acquired a massive stake in our company. He was a textbook corporate parasite, the kind of man who wore custom suits that smelled of expensive cologne and ruthless ambition. His entire vocabulary consisted of meaningless buzzwords like synergy, agile transformation, and paradigm shifts. To him, anything that was not a flashy new application was considered dead weight, and to his eyes I was merely legacy code occupying an expensive office. He swaggered through the corridors, handing out meaningless performance metrics and demanding faster deployment cycles. I once asked him to clarify his stance on our load balancing redundancy protocols, just to test him. He completely deflected, giving me a generic answer about delegating technical weeds to the engineering team. He did not know the first thing about software architecture, but he knew how to slash budgets and present shiny quarterly reports. I just nodded, returned to my desk, and kept the infrastructure from collapsing under his unrealistic demands. Everything changed this morning. Trent's assistant sent me a sudden message requesting a brief alignment meeting. When I walked into the executive suite, Trent was flanked by Denise and Victor, the two senior human resources directors, who always looked perfectly devoid of human emotion. Trent stood up and offered a handshake that I did not take. He then sat back down, steepling his fingers, and delivered a heavily rehearsed speech about structural modernization and trimming redundant legacy positions. He actually looked me in the eye and stated that I had experienced a good run, but they needed fresh perspectives. Denise slid a termination agreement across the polished mahogany table, her eyes darting nervously toward my hands. They expected me to argue. They expected a 48-year-old man who had dedicated his entire adult life to the company to beg for his position or demand an explanation. I did not give them the satisfaction. I simply stood up, ignored the severance packet, and walked out of the room. I did not mention the outdated intellectual property contracts. I did not warn them that firing the sole architect of their proprietary network would trigger a catastrophic cascade of access failures. I just let the silence hang in the air, thick and heavy, until the door clicked shut behind me. The exit was quiet, but the fallout was going to be deafening. The strange thing about getting fired from a job you practically built is how polite the executioners try to make it feel. If they use enough soft corporate language and speak in gentle tones, they believe it somehow masks the brutality of what is actually happening. Trent's assistant had initially framed the meeting as a quick touch base, a phrase designed to sound harmless. But the moment I saw Denise and Victor sitting there with their laptops already open, their faces perfectly blank, I knew it was an ambush. And Trent had smiled. That was the detail that stayed with me as I walked through the rain-swept parking lot toward my vehicle. He had smiled like a man who genuinely believed he had just eliminated his biggest obstacle to absolute control. I unlocked my sedan, tossed my single box of personal belongings onto the passenger seat, and sat behind the steering wheel in total silence. For several minutes, I powered down my company-issued smartphone mid-vibration and tossed it into the glove compartment. They could retrieve their expensive device whenever they felt brave enough to ask for it. The rain drummed steadily against the windshield, matching the rhythmic thumping of my own pulse. I did not drive toward my apartment. Instead, I navigated through the slick downtown traffic, heading west toward an old suburban neighborhood I had not visited in over 7 years. I parked in front of a small, unpretentious diner tucked between a defunct hardware store and a laundromat. It was the kind of establishment that still featured cracked vinyl booths, faded neon signs, and coffee that tasted slightly like burnt toast. I pushed open the heavy glass door, welcoming the sudden rush of warm air and the familiar scent of fried bacon and cheap vanilla syrup. I chose a booth in the far corner, sliding into the worn seat with my leather briefcase resting heavily on the table. A waitress named Clara, who looked like she had been working there since the 1990s, poured me a mug of black coffee without me having to ask. I thanked her, waited for her to step away, and then unlatched the heavy brass buckles of my briefcase. I pulled out a thick, navy blue folder that had been meticulously organized and securely locked away in my home safe for over 15 years. Nobody at Zenith Core knew this folder existed. Inside its protective plastic sleeves lay the actual foundation of their entire $850 million empire, documented in legally binding ink. I flipped to the first section, revealing the original independent contractor agreement dated 23 years ago. Back during our chaotic startup phase, the original founders were operating on borrowed money and blind optimism. They could not afford to pay me a standard engineering salary for the first 8 months of development. I had worked grueling 18-hour shifts, surviving on promises and equity options that had not yet materialized. Because of this massive financial discrepancy, our first legal advisor drafted a unique provisional agreement to protect my immense upfront labor. I traced my finger over the specific clause, highlighted in pale yellow. The exact language stated that all intellectual property, source code, and underlying software architecture developed by Elias Vance shall remain the sole proprietary asset of Horizon Core Limited Liability Company until a formal equity buyout and intellectual property transfer is fully executed and notarized by both participating parties. Horizon Core Limited Liability Company was a private shell corporation I had registered, purely to hold my technical assets. The founders called it a temporary placeholder. They promised we would clean up the paperwork the moment our first round of venture capital funding cleared the bank. But as the company exploded in growth, priorities shifted. We landed massive government contracts, expanded our server farms, and hired hundreds of new employees. The founders became obsessed with revenue projections and international marketing campaigns. The temporary placeholder was completely forgotten by everyone except me. I had gently reminded them about the pending intellectual property transfer 3 separate times over the years. I even had printed email chains from 15 years ago, proving I had flagged the unresolved licensing issue to the chief financial officer. The responses were always dismissive. They told me they would eventually loop in the legal department when they had more bandwidth, claiming it was just an administrative formality. They were so blinded by their rapid success that they never bothered to close the most critical legal loophole in their corporate history. I continued to silently update, secure, and expand the Zenith Nexus platform, ensuring it routed exclusively through the authentication gateways registered to Horizon Core. I was fiercely loyal, and they mistook that loyalty for complete surrender. They assumed the software belonged to the corporation because it existed on their servers, completely ignoring the federal copyright laws that protected my original authorship. I took a slow sip of the scalding coffee and pulled out my personal laptop. I connected to the diner's unsecured wireless network and immediately drafted a secure email to Nolan Pierce, my longtime personal attorney. Nolan was a brilliant legal mind who specialized in high-stakes intellectual property litigation. He was the kind of man who could tear apart a Fortune 500 legal defense without raising his voice. The subject line of my email was simple and direct. I typed out that I had just been terminated, and it was time to initiate the Federal Copyright Enforcement Protocols under Title 17 of the United States Code, Section 106. This specific federal statute grants the copyright owner the exclusive rights to reproduce, distribute, and display the copyrighted work, meaning any unauthorized use constitutes immediate federal infringement. The true beauty of enterprise software architecture is that when it fails, it rarely implodes with a dramatic explosion. Instead, it begins with quiet, subtle fractures that gradually escalate into an uncontrollable systemic collapse. At exactly 10:17 in the morning, approximately 2 hours after I had been unceremoniously escorted from the building, the first digital fracture occurred. A major regional healthcare network attempted to log into their customized patient analytics dashboard to pull their critical quarterly compliance reports. The system hesitated for 5 agonizing seconds before returning a blunt authentication error message. The screen simply displayed a permission denied prompt, accompanied by a string of cryptic back-end diagnostic codes. 3 minutes later, a massive logistics conglomerate on the East Coast reported that their internal freight tracking modules had completely frozen. Their automated invoices were stuck in a continuous verification loop, unable to access the core routing algorithms. By 10:30, the customer success hotline at Zenith Core began ringing with a frantic urgency that had not been heard in over a decade. The support team initially assumed it was a standard server timeout or a minor firewall glitch. They had no idea they were witnessing the first wave of a catastrophic infrastructure lockdown. You see, the core authentication modules of the Zenith Nexus platform were not just heavily encrypted. They were fundamentally tethered to the licensing credentials owned by Horizon Core Limited Liability Company. When I designed the security handshake protocols 15 years ago, I intentionally structured the architecture to route every single verification request through a proprietary digital gateway that I personally controlled. The legacy security keys had actually expired 3 weeks prior. I was the only individual who ever remembered to manually rotate the cryptographic certificates on a schedule that no one else in the engineering department even bothered to track. When the Human Resources Department eagerly deactivated my corporate email and suspended my administrative access that morning, they inadvertently severed the company's only connection to the updated authentication substructure. They had aggressively locked me out of their building, but in doing so, They had securely locked themselves out of their own $850 million software empire. By 11 o'clock, the situation inside the Zenith Core Engineering Department had escalated from mild confusion to sheer, unadulterated panic. Security camera footage would later reveal Trent Holloway storming into the primary server control room like a furious dictator, demanding absolute obedience from his terrified subordinates. He was barking orders at the junior developers, demanding they immediately reboot the production environment and clear the system caches. The head of operations, a nervous young man who had only been with the company for 8 months, desperately tried to explain that rebooting the servers would not bypass a hard-coded authentication denial. Trent refused to listen. He demanded they overwrite the permission protocols and force a system override. He was shouting commands at the engineering team, entirely oblivious to the fact that the core architecture was refusing their credentials like a heavily armed security guard, turning away trespassers at a bank vault. The back-end systems were not broken. They were functioning exactly as I had designed them to function under unauthorized access conditions. The system simply did not recognize their authority anymore. The chaos rapidly spread across every department. The sales executives were fielding furious calls from Fortune 500 procurement directors who were entirely unable to verify their multi-million-dollar invoice packages. The finance department could not access the regional revenue streams, and the legal department began receiving breach of contract threats from major international clients. The developers desperately traced the server logs upstream, searching for the root cause of the massive blackout. That was when they finally realized the terrifying truth. There was no upstream connection available. The central heartbeat server, the primary codebase that determined exactly where and how massive amounts of client data flowed, had vanished from the active operational environment. It had not been deleted or maliciously destroyed. It had simply become completely unreachable, masked behind an impenetrable wall of red tape and cryptographic isolation. The architecture had retreated behind a digital invisibility cloak, protecting itself from an administration that no longer held the proper legal clearance. By noon, nearly 40% of our enterprise client base could not access their primary operational dashboards. The internal corporate chat channels were melting down with panicked inquiries. Project managers were frantically asking who had changed the core routing protocols, why the encryption keys were suddenly failing, and who had approved a massive back-end update during peak operational hours. The most desperate message came from a senior systems analyst who asked if Elias had left a secure credentials document before he was terminated. The only answer he received was a grim confirmation that I had walked out with nothing but a single cardboard box. Trent Holloway stormed back into his expansive corner office, his expensive cologne now failing to mask the stench of his own panicked sweat. He aggressively slapped a tablet away when his assistant tried to show him the escalating failure rates. He demanded his team locate the last person who had touched the authentication modules. When his lead engineer cautiously informed him that the last person was Elias Vance, a heavy, suffocating silence fell over the executive suite. Trent slowly sat down in his leather chair, staring at the massive infrastructure map displayed on his monitor. Entire branches of the proprietary codebase were grayed out, indicating severed connections. The internal administrative panel displayed a stark message stating that access had been permanently revoked. Trent suddenly realized that the legacy employee he had casually discarded was not just a stubborn engineer. I was the actual foundation of the entire company, and I had taken the blueprint with me. While Zenith Core headquarters descended into absolute operational anarchy, I was sitting comfortably in Nolan Pierce's expansive downtown office, enjoying a second cup of premium espresso. My personal smartphone, which had been powered down for several hours, finally vibrated to life when I turned it back on to retrieve a two-factor authentication code. The moment the screen illuminated, the notification center practically exploded. I had 47 desperate text messages, 13 urgent voicemails, and exactly 185 missed calls. I did not bother listening to a single one of them. The device buzzed repeatedly with a blocked caller identification, indicating that Trent Holloway's fragile confidence was rapidly unraveling. I calmly muted the device, flipped it face down on the polished mahogany table, and returned my attention to the immaculate legal documents Nolan had meticulously prepared. Nolan leaned back in his leather chair, a subtle smile playing across his face as he observed my entirely unbothered demeanor. He noted that the corporate executives were likely experiencing a catastrophic meltdown, comparing their structural integrity to a poorly constructed tower of blocks suddenly exposed to a hurricane. I simply nodded, sliding another folder across the table, revealing the exact legal trap they had blindly walked into. Back at the corporate headquarters, the situation had shifted from a technical emergency to a full-blown legal nightmare. At 12:46 in the afternoon, the chief legal counsel attempted to forcefully push an emergency software patch to bypass the failing authentication gateways. It was a desperate, blunt force maneuver, the kind of frantic tactic employed when you throw a massive amount of resources at a problem and pray the system miraculously surrenders. The system did not surrender. Instead, it triggered a hard-coded legal stop protocol that I had embedded deep within the architecture years ago. The central monitors across the engineering floor suddenly flashed a stark warning message. The prompt clearly stated that an unauthorized access attempt had been logged, noting that the primary license holder was not verified. It explicitly denied the patch request under the core operating agreement, declaring that the registered owner of the proprietary framework was Horizon Core Limited Liability Company, legally registered to Elias Vance. That specific notification was the catalyst that ignited the ultimate executive panic. The engineering department frantically contacted the legal department. The legal department desperately contacted the human resources directors. Finally, with sweaty palms and a mounting sense of absolute dread, the chief legal counsel marched directly into the executive war room to confront Trent Holloway. Trent was pacing furiously, his face flushed with a mixture of rage and profound confusion. He demanded to know why the engineering team was claiming that a terminated employee somehow owned the company's primary software platform. The lead corporate attorney slid his laptop across the massive conference table, displaying the digital registration records. He carefully explained that Elias did not just own a piece of the code. Technically, the entire executable layer that governs client access and central data routing belonged exclusively to Horizon Core Limited Liability Company. He further clarified that Zenith Core had never officially acquired, merged, or legally transferred the licensing rights from my private entity. Trent stared at the screen, blinking rapidly as if he were trying to comprehend a foreign language. He insisted that the software was built on company time, arguing that it automatically belonged to the corporation. The chief legal counsel took a deep breath, producing a faded printed document that had been extracted from a deeply archived digital vault. He pointed directly to the intellectual property clause drafted 23 years ago. He read the text aloud, emphasizing that the licensing rights remain with the original author until formally transferred or renegotiated in a notarized writing. The crushing silence that followed was physically palpable. The room of highly paid executives suddenly realized they had built an $850 million empire on a foundation they did not actually own. And then, the ultimate consequence arrived in the form of a booming voice echoing from the conference room's speakerphone. The original founder of the company, calling in directly from a luxury vineyard vacation in Europe, had just received the catastrophic service interruption reports. He demanded an immediate explanation as to why the core platform had completely locked out their largest international clients. Trent nervously attempted to spin the disaster, stammering that it was merely a temporary permissions error and that the licensing agreement was supposed to have been updated years ago. The founder exploded, his voice cracking like a whip across the quiet room. He furiously pointed out that Trent had confidently fired the only individual who held the master keys to their entire technological infrastructure without ever bothering to verify the legal ownership trail. Trent desperately tried to deflect the blame, claiming that I had never warned them about the pending licensing issue, suggesting that I had intentionally hidden the structural vulnerability, That was the exact moment the chief legal counsel delivered the final, devastating blow. He produced a printed email chain dated 18 months ago. The subject line clearly referenced an intellectual property assignment review and an infrastructure audit recommendation. The email explicitly offered to walk Trent through the necessary legal cleanup regarding the Horizon Core licensing transfer. Right beneath my detailed request was Trent's dismissive, two-sentence reply. Trent had explicitly written that the legal transfer was not a priority, instructing me to focus entirely on modernization and forward velocity instead. The founder was absolutely livid. He stated that they were exactly one major client's escalation away from a massive class action lawsuit for breach of contract, and one federal inquiry away from a catastrophic securities violation. He brutally reprimanded Trent, declaring that he had fired the absolute architect of their core product without cause, without legal review, and without confirming basic operational ownership. The emergency shareholder meeting was officially scheduled for 5 o'clock in the evening, but the sheer gravity of the situation had forced the executive board to convene much earlier. By 4:30, the primary conference room was packed with frantic legal advisors, sweating risk managers, and board members who looked entirely exhausted from hours of spinning their wheels in the chaotic aftermath of their own catastrophic negligence. The vibrant, confident energy that usually permeated the executive floor had been entirely replaced by a grim, suffocating desperation. Trent Holloway sat at the far end of the massive table, his expensive custom suit noticeably wrinkled, his tie loosened, and his trademark arrogant smile completely erased. He looked like a man who had just realized he was standing on a highly volatile explosive device that he had personally armed. The original founder, having chartered an emergency private flight from Europe, stormed into the room without bothering to greet anyone. He carried a single, thick leather folder containing the surgical licensing proposal that Nolan Pierce and I had finalized just hours prior. The founder did not ease into the discussion with pleasantries or corporate jargon. He stood at the head of the table, his face tight with controlled fury, and began reading the exact terms of my mandatory licensing agreement aloud. His voice echoed through the tense room as he meticulously detailed every single non-negotiable demand. He stated that Elias Vance required a 3-year exclusive operational license, an upfront payment of $90 million, and a mandatory 10% royalty on all future client installations, utilizing the Horizon Core architecture. He paused, ensuring every board member absorbed the staggering financial weight of those numbers before continuing down the list. He read that I demanded full architectural oversight, retained exclusively by me, complete with board-level veto power regarding any structural modifications. Furthermore, the company was required to issue a formal public retraction of my sudden termination, explicitly clarifying that my brief departure was the result of severe internal executive miscommunication and absolutely not related to my professional performance. The room was completely silent, the kind of absolute quiet that only occurs when incredibly wealthy individuals realize they are completely trapped. But the final demand was the one that truly sealed the inevitable outcome. The founder flipped to the last page of the document, his eyes locking directly onto Trent Holloway. He read Clause 15, which explicitly required the immediate and permanent removal of Trent from all operational authority within the corporation. Trent flinched violently, opening his mouth to formulate some kind of defensive argument about modern growth strategies and legacy structural misunderstandings. The founder immediately raised his hand, aggressively silencing him before he could utter a single word. He furiously commanded Trent to remain entirely silent, forbidding him from attempting to blame a clerical oversight or lack of prioritized communication. The founder brutally reminded everyone in the room that they possessed the definitive email chains, the ignored audit recommendations, and the precise messages where Trent had arrogantly dismissed the essential legal transfer as a low-priority objective. The founder then turned his attention back to the terrified board of directors, his voice dropping to a dangerously calm volume. He announced that a formal vote had already been conducted in a closed executive session just prior to this meeting. He confirmed that the board had universally accepted all of my terms without any further negotiation. The $90 million licensing contract was officially approved. Then, with a chilling sense of absolute finality, the founder looked directly at Trent and told him that his tenure at the company was completely finished. The resulting silence was absolutely profound. Not a single executive spoke. Not a single chair shifted. The entire board simply watched as the man who had confidently attempted to modernize the company by firing its foundational architect was unceremoniously discarded like a broken piece of obsolete hardware. Trent slowly stood up, his face entirely drained of color, and walked out of the conference room without saying a word. He had tried to erase my 23 years of dedicated history with a smug grin, and in return, he had completely dismantled his own highly lucrative career in less than 8 hours. The following morning, I stood outside the familiar glass door of my old corner office. The hallway was quiet, the usual hum of frantic corporate energy replaced by a strange, almost reverent stillness. My electronic security badge had been officially reactivated by Human Resources 20 minutes prior, granting me full administrative clearance once again. I reached out and pushed the door open, stepping into the space that I had occupied for nearly a quarter of a century. Everything remained exactly as I had left it just 24 hours ago. The drooping potted fern still sat in the corner, the dual monitors remained powered down on the desk, and the framed photograph of the original startup team still sat slightly crooked on the top shelf. I walked over to the wall and flicked the light switch, listening to the familiar soft click as the overhead fluorescent bulbs buzzed to life. I did not feel an overwhelming sense of vindication, nor did I feel the need to gloat over my massive financial victory. I simply felt a quiet, profound sense of balance being restored. They had blindly assumed that true corporate power resided in flashy executive titles, expensive corner offices, and meaningless strategic buzzwords. They had completely forgotten that the most powerful individual in any organization is the one who actually understands how the entire foundation is constructed. They had confidently attempted to erase me, believing I was nothing more than a disposable relic, holding them back from their shiny new future. Now, they were legally forced to pay a massive premium simply to rent the infrastructure I had built with my own 2 hands.